Dr. John Plum was confirmed in March of 2022 as the first Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy. In this role, he is responsible for the overall supervision of policy for the DoD for space warfighting. His policy portfolio encompasses the department's strategic capabilities, which include almost everything, right? Integrated deterrence from space, nuclear weapons, cyber, missile defense, electromagnetic warfare, and countering weapons of mass destruction. Dr. Plum has served in various national security roles, both in and out of uniform, for nearly 3 decades. As an active duty U.S. Navy submarine officer, he served on a fast attack LA-class submarine and as an instructor at the Navy's Nuclear Power School. He holds a BS in physics from the University of Notre Dame, go Irish, and a MS in physics and PhD in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado. And he's got a zillion awards listed here, academic, military, and civil. We don't have a lot of time, but just very, very accomplished. So thank you very much for being here. William, I'm looking to you to keep us on time. General Bolden's following me so that I don't have to do extra push-ups. We're going to try to keep things on track. So let's think back to just about a little over 2 years ago. So March 2022, DoD decides to make this position in first position. Why was that the right time, and why were you the right person for that role?
So first of all, thanks for this opportunity. It's great to be here at beautiful, beautiful place, unbelievable. So the Congress created my role, just to be very clear, and they created my role at the same time they created the Space Force, the same time they elevated Space Command to be a combatant command, and the same time that they created a position inside the Department of the Air Force, Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Space Acquisition, which is filled by Frank Calvelli. So in one NDAA, FY20 NDAA, all of these things happened, and I think it was a reflection of really the growing importance of space to national security, and also kind of this cumulative frustration over decades, frankly, that the way the department was doing space was too cumbersome and basically was all designed about a bunch of people that could say no as opposed to giving us to better answers. And I think the Congress did it just about right in the way they did this. And the one thing I'll say, you asked about my role. My role as Secretary of Defense for Space Policy is to be the administration voice in this policy making. And that turns out to be very useful to ensuring that the department is moving in the right direction and understanding, where that narrative should be. And I feel like I had not appreciated that coming in, how important it is to have a Senate confirmed member of the administration in that role for this, to move this in the right direction.
And nothing has slowed down since then. So with that coordination, with that integration, just earlier this month, the department released its commercial space integration strategy. So for audience members, I know a lot are familiar, but for those that aren't familiar, can you briefly summarize what that was and maybe what some of the conclusions were?
Yeah, so first of all, I think the amount of speed and momentum we have behind several lines of effort has proven that this kind of new organizational structure is working. Commercial space integration strategy, my team we just got this released in the last month. Really proud of it. It took us well over a year to put together. Basic fundamental driving reason here is it is very clear that in the United States of America, the innovation in the space domain is happening in the commercial sector. That is distinct from the defense industrial base, who responds to the contracts we specifically ask them for. They build the thing we specifically asked for. The commercial sector is building things on the commercial market. They're moving fast. They're trying to find out how to drive their costs down. Proliferated low Earth orbit, for example, is a thing coming straight out of the commercial sector. And we have to harness that innovation. And so what the fundamental piece here is, that is where the innovation is happening. That is where the department needs to take part in that and try to figure out how to harness that for national security purposes. And it's a nice, short, concise strategy. We're very proud of the fact that you can read it and not fall asleep. So I'd encourage you all to look that up. It's completely unclassified on purpose to hold ourselves accountable to it.
And so one of the things in there, though, it starts to allude, in the last panel talked a little bit about tech and technology. Can you give us just an overview of maybe some of the emerging areas that were highlighted in that report in terms of new areas that we need to consider?
Yeah, so we tried to map closely how the Space Force is approaching different space mission areas. I believe there's 13 different mission areas. And so, then we tried to break down, out of these mission areas, which ones really are the purview of governments which ones could be some government and some commercial, and then which ones could commercial basically take over. So for instance, launch is covered under something called Space Access, Mobility and Logistics. It's a mouthful, but launch is basically entirely commercial at this point. No problem. Right. A growing one that I talk about routinely is this issue of in-space refueling. That's not a thing the U.S. government has. The thing that limits your ability to continue to operate a satellite in space is it runs out of fuel. And of course it takes, it's extra mass to put into space, and then at some point you run out of fuel. If you could refuel, a lot of satellites could continue to operate. There's a few companies out there that have figured out how to do this, and that's on old satellites. Now we're looking at what if you built your satellite designed to refuel, and what would that offer you from a kind of a cost benefit and operational benefit?
Okay, so let's switch a little bit. So we're at a space diplomacy conference. Some would say it's tough to advance diplomacy in space without compromising national security. Obviously, those two things need to go hand in hand. But as we look at, there was a quote from NASA Administrator Bill Nelson recently talking about the fact that China's, quote, so-called civilian space program is a military program. To what extent, from your position, from a DoD position, is DoD concerned that the ILRS or other things that China is doing is or might become a military operation?
Yeah, well, thanks, Kurt. So let me take that in two pieces. Your first question is diplomacy at odds with national security? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Right? I mean, Sun Tzu, your first way to achieve your goal is through strategy. Your second is through the diplomacy, and the worst possible way is through military force. So no, diplomacy is absolutely right up there with national security. And I think done correctly, should strengthen national security or stability for all parties. On the specific issue of militarization of the moon, I just personally, as a Department of Defense person, do not buy that. I do not think that is an achievable thing. I do not think anybody could militarily protect logistics chain all the way to the moon. I think the idea that folks might want to use their militaries to understand what is happening that other countries are doing in orbits around the moon, that makes sense, but I think that's a far cry from militarization.
Okay. Another area, so shifting from China, looking at Russia, in February there were reports that emerging that Russia had an intent to send a nuclear warhead into space. Obviously, this would be a strict violation of the UN Outer Space Treaty, and we can all imagine the effects that would happen if on satellite technology and everything else in orbit. Any thoughts on that? Or is that something that's come up? Is that something that you've seen in your job?
Yeah, so it has come up. Yes, we take it very seriously. It's a very serious threat. And I think just before this panel started, people were talking about the fact that we just helped, and the department firmly supported the resolution of the UN to reaffirm commitments to not place nuclear weapons in outer space. Putin himself has said that he has no intention of doing it, and so it's very confusing why they would veto a resolution that basically tells them to affirm the thing they've already agreed to do. But a very troubling possibility. And I don't think we've heard the end of this, but a nuclear detonation in space would be devastating. It's completely indiscriminate. Civil, military, national boundaries, none of those things are recognized by a nuclear weapon in space, and could do really lasting damage to low Earth orbit in particular. And so it should be no spacefaring nation, and frankly, no nation who relies on space, which is every nation in the world, should be interested in pursuing such a capability.
Okay. Well, the great thing is, as we say the word nuclear, many of our paradigms are shifting from weapons to very positive uses of nuclear energy in space, whether that's nuclear thermal propulsion or the RFP that's out from NASA to put a small modular reactor on the moon. And that'll be a fission reactor to provide power and survive the night through the dark side and so forth. So, but from a defense and security perspective, what considerations are being taken to ensure the success of that project?
I'm not sure I'm tracking what you're specifically asking. So there are, federal regulations on being able to put nuclear material on a launch, and it requires a lot of very, very careful planning and possibly a little bit too laborious from what we hope to get to.
Yep.
And I think the department would support making that safe, but not so restrictive that it sets us back. I think anyone that really thinks about this deeply, I think, you said nuclear thermal. Let's not forget nuclear electric propulsion, which I happen to be a fan of. So,
Fair.
but both, those are two very different cases, but a long-term power source, whether in space or if we're trying to colonize or even have some type of outposts on the moon or on Mars or something, those are both really useful ways to use power.
Okay. One of the other areas that you've had in your role has to do with cybersecurity. And so if we think about, and we all know the increasing importance almost on a daily basis of cyber and everything that we do on Earth, but certainly Earth to Leo, Leo to Leo, and Leo beyond are increasingly important, particularly as new systems are being designed. How should policymakers think about the importance of designing security by design and then countering cyber threats to those systems?
Yeah, so cyber threats to space systems are probably the highest level threat because one, they can be done from your basement, right? You don't need a lot of hardware to do these types of things. And two, in the department, we say there's a possibility for something we might call a volume kill, which is if you can hack somebody's command and control system for a constellation, perhaps you could take the whole thing down. People building satellites now, they need to be building cyber defense in from the ground up, which is a lot easier than doing cyber, like patching it back on to systems we built 20 years ago that are still up there. And then the other thing, folks, anyone designing hardware today, you just need to assume that your systems have been penetrated by an adversary, which is very different than thinking you can keep them out. And so then how do you get to that zero trust piece? And I will just say, we are well aware that this is a problem. We have to work on it. And the commercial strategy I talked about recognizes that cybersecurity may not always be, at this point in time, like the first thing that someone's trying to invest in when they're trying to close a business case. And so that's some of the tension involved between a commercial entity and what the department needs, because we need things to be able to work not just in peacetime, but also in conflict. And if they don't work in conflict, I don't really want them in my system because that's what I'm here for.
Right, okay. Well, before we turn it over to the audience for questions, it's been a fast 26, 27 months.
Yeah.
So you've announced your intention to step down next month. So as you look back over your time in this, again, pioneering office, what are you most proud of? What are your hopes for how the DoD thinks about future engagement with space?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I would say the thing I'm most proud of is I really think my office and my team, we have changed the approach to space within the department. When I was in the Obama administration, every space meeting was a fight. It was a fight between the IC and DoD. The IC almost always won, for those of you tracking how that works. But so instead what we did this time, from the moment I got there, we built a collaborative system, brought all stakeholders together. If there were security clearance limitations, we got them in. So we didn't keep people out, we brought folks in so we could all have the conversation at the right level, so as it went up the chain, people were on the same page. That has paid just enormous dividends, both in building a stronger network of colleagues, but also in results. And just on the way forward, since this is a diplomacy forum, I would say the need for diplomacy with China, I think on every front, is pretty clear to this audience. I think space offers a unique opportunity there because as China continues to increase its own presence in space, we both have driving concerns that we need to be talking about. How do we keep the domain stable? How do we avoid collisions? What are the proper ways? And I think that should give us a hook, both countries a hook, to continue to talk, and ideally not take those talks down every time there's a kerfuffle at higher levels. And I think, to me, that is really a really positive piece, and the department would be all in on helping drive those conversations.
Well, in my position, I'll just say, and on behalf of everyone, thank you for what you've done there and setting a course which your successor can now take and continue those principles. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt. Really appreciate it.
Okay, we have a few minutes, I'm being told, for Q&A. Any questions from the audience? Space diplomacy? There's one right here.
What are some kind of recent or emerging kind of innovations that really excite the DoD? Like I've heard things about like space solar powering like forward operating bases. And then maybe if you have a moment, how do you then secure kind of assets in space since they are so vulnerable and countries are thinking about developing ways to kind of get rid of them.
Yeah, thanks. So 2 separate questions. First of all, I haven't been part of any space solar for forward base conversations, but you are correct that, I mean, that people aren't thinking about developing weapons, they are developing weapons. And so how do you protect against one attack on one satellite causing a devastating loss to what you're trying to accomplish? So one of the main ways we're looking at that is making sure that we have built resilience into our systems, including in space, including on the ground, which leads me to your original part, which is what's very exciting. What's very exciting right now to me is proliferated low Earth orbit satellite communications. It's most evidenced by Starlink right now. There are other companies coming. We've just begun to unlock the potential of that, and that's just SATCOM. There are other things you can do, but by having 1,000 satellites or 10,000 satellites or whatever the number is, one, the problem about defense kind of goes away because you can't, if a couple satellites are neutralized by an adversary, it has almost no noticeable effect on the constellation performance. But 2, the ability to move information around quickly, which is absolutely key to the way the department thinks about conflict in the 21st century, is really, it's just an amazing difference what you can do with this much bandwidth through space and at those low latency levels. And you're seeing that play out in Ukraine right now, and the department is starting to look, what are the things you can do with this? It's really remarkable.
Last question. There's one right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Josephine Millward from Alpam Capital. I'm an early stage venture capital investor. Can you talk about DoD mission areas where you would like to see more innovation from the private sector?
Where I'd like to see more innovation from the private sector?
Yes. And what are you looking for?
Look, I think what we're fundamentally looking for, without getting into the eaches, is technology that we can rely on, not just in peacetime, but in conflict. Technologies the tech refresh rate is sufficient that we don't have to design requirements for 20 years out, maybe 5 years out, 7 years out, and if it keeps upgrading, then that gives us that's a totally different way than we've been thinking about doing things ourselves for many years, right? That quicker refresh rate. And then that last part, we talked about cybersecurity. There has to be some, minimum set for the department. Do we say, okay, this is sufficient for our needs, and maybe we could add on to that? But I think those would be the kind of 3 main pieces I'd be thinking about without getting into a specific widget.
Okay, well, there's no question that there is a role for the Department of Defense, continued role in diplomacy and securing the vision you talked about, the integration, the coordination, the understanding of the threat, and the understanding of how to bring the private and public sector together for technology. So again, thank you for your leadership and setting us on the right path. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable John Plumb.
All right. Hey, thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Yeah.